In the remote hollows of the Missouri Ozarks, where fog clings to ancient hills and secrets decay in silence, stood a cabin that would harbor America's most disturbing family crimes. It was 1877, over a decade after the Civil War, when whispers began circulating about the Crow family, a widow named Adeline and her 7-foot-tall twin sons, Jedediah and Hezekiah. These giants had lived in complete isolation for years, speaking only in scripture-laden fragments and trading with no one. But when rumors spread that 50-year-old Adeline was pregnant, with no man having visited their property, the unthinkable became undeniable. Sheriff Eli Vance would soon discover that this incestuous union was merely the surface of a horror that stretched back decades. Hidden beneath their root cellar lay the remains of countless travelers who had vanished crossing Crowland, victims of what Adeline called God provision and harvesting the Canaanites. How did these giant brothers justify becoming their own mother's lovers? What twisted theology allowed a family to motor for 20 years undetected? And what finally brought their reign of terror into the light? Subscribe to stand with us as we uncover these buried truths and comment your city and time. Let's explore this darkness together. The year was 1877, and the Missouri Ozarks remained a landscape unto itself, a maze of steep ridges, dark hollows, and unnamed creeks that swallowed sound as surely as they swallowed secrets. More than a decade had passed since the Civil War's end. Yet this corner of Tenney County felt untouched by time's passage. Here, among hills so densely forested that noon felt like twilight, civilization's reach grew thin. Roads were little more than deer paths widened by ox carts, and a man's nearest neighbor might live 5 miles away through terrain that could break an ankle or worse. It was a place where the outside world's rules bent to older, harsher laws, where family loyalty meant everything, and a stranger's disappearance might go unnoticed for years, if ever. The people who called these hills home were cut from different cloth than their flatland neighbors. They were the descendants of Scots-Irish settlers who had pushed westward, seeking not opportunity, but solitude, fierce, independent souls who viewed government with suspicion and settled disputes with their own hands. A sheriff's badge carried weight in the county seat. But out here in the deep hollows, a man's authority ended where another man's property line began. Families had lived on the same ridge for generations, their bloodlines as intertwined as the mountain laurel that choked the hillsides. They spoke little to outsiders, traded only when necessity demanded, and kept their own counsel in matters both sacred and profane. It was into this isolated world that the Crow family had carved their place, though family seemed too gentle a word for what they had become. Adeline Crow was a widow approaching her 6th decade, a gaunt woman with eyes like flint, who had migrated west from Tennessee after her husband's death. She had brought with her twin sons, Jedediah and Hezekiah, boys who had grown into something that defied easy description. Both stood nearly 7 feet in height, their frames broad and powerful from years of hard mountain labor. Their faces bore the same angular features, the same pale eyes, the same expression of watchful silence that unnerved anyone who encountered them. The twins moved through the world like shadows of each other, speaking in a clipped shorthand that seemed to consist entirely of biblical phrases and their mother's commands. When they appeared in town, which was seldom, they conducted their business with mechanical efficiency and departed without pleasantries. Locals had learned not to stare too long, ask too many questions. There was something about the way they stood, the way they watched, that suggested dangerous depths beneath their quiet exterior. Even the boldest men in the county gave the Crow brothers wide berth. Their homestead reflected their isolation perfectly. Perched on a ridge 15 miles from the nearest settlement, the cabin was accessible only by a narrow track that wound through stands of oak and hickory so thick they formed a natural fortress. No smoke from neighboring chimneys marked the horizon. No church bells rang on Sunday mornings. The Crows attended no services, participated in no community gatherings, and seemed to exist in a world entirely of their own making. Their few interactions with the outside world came through necessity: salt, flour, ammunition, purchased with gold coins that raised questions about their source but were quickly forgotten in the face of hard currency. For years, this arrangement had suited everyone involved. The crows kept to themselves, and their neighbors respected that ancient mountain code that said a man's business was his own. Strange stories circulated, as they always did about isolated families. Tales of midnight lights in their windows, of voices heard singing hymns in harmonies too perfect to be entirely human. But these were whispers shared over evening fires, ghost stories that passed along winter nights. No one suspected that behind the walls of that distant cabin, a darkness was growing that would eventually demand a reckoning with the outside world. The autumn of 1877 brought more than the usual mountain gossip to Tenney County. Word had begun to spread through the scattered settlements that Adeline Crow, the stern widow who lived with her giant sons in the remote hollow, was with child. At first, the whispers were dismissed as malicious speculation, the kind of talk that idle tongues conjured during long winter evenings. But as weeks passed and the rumors persisted, carried by trappers and peddlers who claimed to have glimpsed the condition from a distance, the impossible became undeniable. Adeline Crow, who had been widowed for nearly 2 decades and lived in complete isolation with only her son for company, was expecting a child. The implications of this development sent shock waves through the tight-knit mountain communities. In a place where every family knew every other family's business, going back 3 generations, where a stranger's arrival was noted and discussed for weeks, the idea that a man had somehow been visiting the Crow homestead undetected seemed absurd. The terrain itself made clandestine meetings nearly impossible. The single track leading to their cabin was visible for miles to anyone who knew where to look. Yet the alternative explanation was one that even the most hardened mountain folk could not bring themselves to voice aloud. It was this unspeakable possibility that drove a distant cousin of the late Mr. Crow to take action. The man, known in court records only as Gable, had ridden 3 days from his farm in a neighboring county after hearing the rumors from a traveling tinker. Family honor, already strained by the Crow's eccentric reputation, now faced complete disgrace. More troubling still was his genuine fear for whatever child might be born under such circumstances. The mountain code demanded that families handle their own affairs, but some sins were too great for private resolution. Sheriff Eli Vance received Gable's report on a cold November morning in 1877. A veteran of the Union Army, now in his late 50s, Vance was a methodical man who had learned patience through decades of frontier law enforcement. He understood the delicate nature of what he was being asked to investigate. In these hills, a man's word was his bond, but it was also his weapon. Accuse the wrong person of the wrong crime, and you might find yourself facing more than legal consequences. Yet Vance also understood his duty, and the implications of what Gable was suggesting could not be ignored. The journey to the Crow homestead took the better part of a day, following deer paths that wound through stands of timber so thick they blocked the sun. Vance traveled alone, as was his custom when conducting preliminary investigations. He had learned that show of force often produced more heat than light in these isolated communities. His horse picked its way carefully along the rocky trail, the silence broken only by the creak of leather and the distant call of crows that seemed to follow their progress through the trees. When Vance finally reached the clearing where the Crow cabin stood, he was met by a sight that would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. The twin brothers emerged from the cabin before he had even dismounted, moving with that eerie synchronization that marked their every action. They stood blocking the path to the door, their massive frames casting long shadows across the yard. Neither spoke, but their message was clear. This was not a place where visitors were welcome. Adeline Crow appeared in the doorway behind them, and Vance could see immediately that the rumors were true. Despite her advanced age and gaunt frame, she was unmistakably pregnant. When she spoke, her voice carried the calm authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. She explained that her child had been born stillborn and buried on their property according to Christian custom. Her tone suggested that this explanation should satisfy any reasonable inquiry, and her son's menacing presence reinforced that suggestion with silent threat. Sheriff Vance returned to the county seat that evening with more questions than answers, but he was a man who understood the value of patience in unraveling complex mysteries. The Crow family's explanation was plausible enough on its surface. Infant mortality was tragically common in these remote settlements, and families often buried their dead on their own land without formal ceremony. Yet something in Adeline's manner, in the way her sons had positioned themselves like sentinels, suggested depths that warranted further investigation. Vance had learned to trust his instincts during the war, and those same instincts now whispered that the Crow Hollow harbored secrets far darker than a stillborn child. Rather than pursue immediate confrontation, Vance chose a path of methodical investigation. He began by examining county records that had accumulated dust in the courthouse basement for years. Reports of missing persons, abandoned property claims, and unexplained disappearances that had been filed and forgotten. What emerged from this painstaking research was a pattern that chilled him to the bone. Over the past 15 years, at least a dozen men had vanished while traveling through the southern portion of Tenney County. These were not local residents whose absence would be immediately noted, but itinerant workers, surveyors, peddlers, prospectors, and drifters whose movements were irregular and whose disappearances might go unnoticed for months or even years. The geographic distribution of these vanishings was what truly captured Vance's attention. When plotted on his hand-drawn map, the locations formed a rough circle with the Crow homestead at its center. Some had been last seen heading toward the remote hollow on foot, carrying surveying equipment or peddlers' packs. Others had simply vanished from camps along the creek that bordered Crow property. The pattern was subtle enough to escape casual notice, but undeniable once recognized. These men had encountered something deadly in the shadow of these towering hills. Vance's investigation took on new urgency as winter deepened into 1878. He began visiting the families and communities where these missing men had last been seen, reconstructing their final movements with the patience of a hunter tracking wounded prey. In smoky cabins and around flickering hearths, he listened to half-remembered conversations and fragmentary recollections. A surveyor named Thomas Hartley had mentioned planning to map the Crow section before disappearing in 1872. A peddler called Old Pete had been seen heading up the Hollow Trail in 1875, his cart loaded with goods, but neither man nor merchandise had ever emerged. The breakthrough came not from human testimony, but from the Missouri landscape itself. Spring floods in 1878 proved exceptionally severe, scouring creek beds and reshaping the topography with violent efficiency. It was a local hunter, following a wounded deer along the swollen banks of the creek that bordered Crow property, who made the discovery that would transform suspicion into evidence. Protruding from freshly eroded soil was a leather satchel, its contents preserved by the tanning process and the peculiar chemistry of Ozark earth. Inside that satchel, Vance found the personal effects of Thomas Hartley, his surveyor's compass, logbook, and identification papers, all bearing his name and the date of his final survey. The logbook's last entry, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, indicated his intention to map the section containing the Crow homestead. More tellingly, the satchel had been buried rather than lost, its placement suggesting deliberate concealment rather than accidental abandonment. After 6 years of questions without answers, Vance finally possessed the physical evidence he needed to justify legal action. Armed with this proof of foul play, Vance assembled a small posse of trusted men, not for their skill with weapons, but for their credibility as witnesses. He understood that whatever they might discover at the Crow homestead would require multiple testimonies to be believed by a court of law. The nature of his suspicions had grown far beyond a single missing surveyor or even a dozen vanished travelers. The isolation of the Crow family, their known hostility to outsiders, and the geographic pattern of disappearances suggested something far more systematic and horrifying than random violence. The second confrontation at the Crow homestead bore little resemblance to Vance's initial visit. This time, he arrived with legal authority backed by physical evidence, accompanied by 4 deputized men whose presence transformed the dynamic entirely. The spring morning of May 15th, 1878, carried an unusual stillness as a posse made its way up the narrow track to the cabin. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned their songs, leaving only the sound of horses' hooves against stone and the creak of leather as the men approached their destination. The Crow family's reaction to this official delegation revealed the first cracks in their previously unshakable composure. Jedediah and Hezekiah emerged from the cabin as before, but their movements lacked the fluid coordination that had marked their early appearance. They stood uncertainly, glancing between the approaching lawmen and the doorway where their mother had yet to appear. When Adeline finally emerged, her condition was immediately apparent. The pregnancy that had sparked the initial investigation was now unmistakably advanced, her gaunt frame unable to conceal the obvious truth of her situation. Vance presented the search warrant with formal precision, explaining that the discovery of Thomas Hartley's surveyor equipment provided legal justification for examining the property. The family's response was immediate and telling. Where they had previously maintained calm authority, now they erupted in righteous fury. Adeline began quoting scripture about persecution and the testing of the faithful, while her sons flanked her like biblical warriors defending sacred ground. Their protests carried the fervor of those who believed themselves divinely protected. Yet underneath that religious zeal lay something that resembled genuine fear. The search began methodically, with Vance directing his men to examine the cabin's interior first. What they found was a dwelling stripped of normal human comfort. Sparse furnishings, no decorative items, walls bare except for a single wooden cross carved with symbols none of the searchers recognized. The absence of personal possessions was striking, as if the family had deliberately purged their living space of anything that might reveal individual personality or preference. Even more unsettling was the overwhelming smell of lye soap, suggesting recent and intensive cleaning that seemed excessive for normal housekeeping. Moving outside, the posse began searching for the infant's grave that Adeline had described during Vance's first visit. They found it precisely where she had indicated, a small mound marked by a rough wooden cross located in what appeared to be a family cemetery containing several older graves. Dr. Alistair Finch, the county physician whom Vance had brought as an expert witness, supervised the careful exhumation of the tiny grave. The process was conducted with appropriate solemnity, but the discovery within confirmed the sheriff's worst fears. The remains were indeed those of a newborn infant, but Dr. Finch's examination revealed disturbing details that transformed tragedy into horror. The skeleton showed signs of trauma inconsistent with natural death, and the burial had been hasty, without the careful preparation typical of families mourning a stillborn child. More significantly, the positioning and condition of the remains suggested the infant had lived for some time after birth before meeting a violent end. This was not the natural tragedy that Adeline had described, but evidence of infanticide committed to conceal an unspeakable crime. As Dr. Finch completed his grim examination, Vance found his attention drawn to other features of the property that had escaped notice during his first visit. The root cellar, in particular, seemed unusually large for a family of three, its heavy stone covering requiring significant effort to move. The twins' agitation increased noticeably whenever the posse approached this structure, their biblical mutterings becoming more frantic and their movements more aggressive. Something about their behavior suggested that the infant's grave, horrific as it was, might represent only the beginning of the truth that lay buried in this isolated hollow. The massive stone slab covering the Crow family's root cellar required combined strength of all 5 men to move, its weight suggesting construction intended for more than simple food storage. As they strained against the ancient limestone, Sheriff Vance noticed how the twins' agitation had transformed into something approaching panic. For the first time since he had known of their existence, Jedediah and Hezekiah appeared genuinely afraid, their biblical mutterings becoming increasingly frantic as the stone slowly shifted from its position. Adeline herself had fallen silent, her face assuming the marble composure of someone preparing for judgment. The smell that emerged from the open cellar was a first indication of what lay beneath. It was not the earthy scent of stored vegetables and preserved goods that one might expect, but something far more sinister, the sweet, cloying odor decay mixed with lime and something else that Dr. Finch would later identify as quicklime, used in hasty attempts at concealment. The posse members instinctively stepped back from the opening, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces as they peered into the darkness below. What they discovered in the cellar's depths would haunt every man present for the remainder of his days. The upper layer contained the expected provisions: sacks of potatoes, barrels of preserved meat, jars of vegetables, but these had been arranged with deliberate care to conceal what lay beneath. As they carefully moved aside the legitimate storage items, the searchers began uncovering personal effect that had no business in the family's food cellar: a peddler's tin cup, dented and tarnished with age, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles, their lenses intact, but their frame bent as if removed with violence, a surveyor's transit, its brass fittings green with corrosion. Each discovery prompted careful documentation by Dr. Finch, who recognized the forensic importance of establishing a clear chain of evidence.